God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men.
Not a very wholesome way to begin a discussion about the main questions, such as why are we here, who are we?
Atheist, agnostic, they go together.
Okay.
Because you don't want to pretend you don't
what's
know.
animating your kind of moral passion then? I mean, is it just the sense that you know this is a wrong, that we could do better than this? I mean, where is it coming
Good question.
from?
So you implicitly state a moral relationship to religion, which is interesting.
I see spirituality and religion as very, very different.
Very good. Okay. We're referring to an atheist. When I say atheist, doesn't mean I'm not necessarily spiritual in the sense of seeing connect. Okay. Well, spirituality is connection.
For the first time, we have the power to decide the fate of our planet and ourselves. This is a time of great danger, but our species is young and curious and brave. It shows much promise. In the last few millennia, we have made the most astonishing and unexpected discoveries about the cosmos and our place within it.
Because this box would have no outside, and therefore it wouldn't be a box.
It's how you understand your relationship to each other, to things, to your body, to your health, to the world, to the universe.
So all propositions, all words, must refer to classes of some kind, and you can't have the class of all classes.
And it's that systemic relationship, and the more you learn about that, the more it defines who you are and your role. And you can look at it mechanistically, or you can look at it, actually, no, you have to look at it mechanistically. I think, and that sounds cold, but what I mean by that is it's the progress of understanding yourself has to be a technical process on some level.
And you can't have the box containing all boxes.
There are gaps between every two ons where you find a field of possibilities, a field of pure potentiality.
There has to be some defining features that can be deduced to a degree and associated, without necessarily there being a meta level that's completely undescribable. You know what I mean?
Science doesn't call it God, but what is God if not the immeasurable potential of all that was, all that is, and all that will be?
Or they can ask it in this way.
What scientific proof or evidence of any sort can you muster to support your assertion that there is, for lack of a better term, God, or some sort of intelligence at the heart of the universe?
What evidence, supposing somebody could bring it forward, would completely satisfy you as disproving the existence of God?
Today, our conversation topic is the psychology of belief, and do we need God to make sense of life? Well, the big conversation partners I'm sitting down with today are Jordan B. Peterson and Susan Blackmore.
What are we here for? What is the just city? How would it look like? What is the meaning of life?
You are listening to Under the Skin with Russell Brand. Today I'll be speaking to Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist who's been called the most controversial scientist on Earth. I'm holding a copy of it in my hands. I'm looking at Rupert Sheldrake, we've been in the studio a matter of minutes. You've challenged the setup of the studio in many ways, the positioning of the microphone, the positioning of the camera. It seems to me that you're a man who continually flies in the face of convention. Have you always been like this, Rupert?
Well, not completely, no. But I have always had a kind of contrarian streak, I suppose.
Because I'm very interested in spirituality. I'm very interested in science, but what you've already said about challenging frameworks is where my particular academic interest lies. I know there's much about convention that I have to learn. Of course I do, like most people.
I think you're happy to describe yourself as an atheist. Does that mean for you that you are a naturalist, someone who's committed to a view that our experiences can be fully explained by a purely material world?
No, I mean, I sign up in a way to naturalism groups and beliefs, but because I work on consciousness such a lot, and the problem of how do we relate the mind-body problem, here's this table, here's my glass of water, we'll agree that if I go like this, it'll go all over the place.
And ruin the microphone.
How does that relate to the taste of the water? These fundamental problems.
But if we talk about consciousness and the laws of nature, we won't be talking about the God that most of our neighbors believe in, which is a personal God who hears our prayers and occasionally answers them. So I just want you to be sensitive to this, because if Michael or I say something derogatory about Islam or Christianity, which seems possible, the response from the other side shouldn't mention quantum mechanics.
Science also tells us that this is a field of non-locality, where everything is correlated with everything else. My adversaries are going to point out, no, everything. God is explained by neurology. Well, I hope today, Michael, that you will convert from a skeptic to a neuroskeptic.
What percentage of those religious people do you think have in mind a God of the sort you just described?
I don't know, Sam. It's a good question, because when I go talk to people, when I talk to people online and use exactly this terminology, millions of people listen.
Because your science is really frozen in the dungeons of conservatism and in the dungeons of orthodoxy.
I was brought up like you as a Christian, and I threw that out because in the end it didn't make sense to me. So that's another way to say I'm left with naturalism. But I'm not left with a naturalism that explains everything. I'm left with a feeling that that's what I want to try to do, to understand what's going on here in minds, in bodies, in tables and glasses of water, and it's very difficult.
And that because they believe our minds are nothing but our brains, then anything that suggests the mind extends further than the brain must be pseudoscientific. So, for example, I've done a lot of research on telepathy, where people, and indeed dogs, I wrote a whole book on animal telepathy called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, based on evidence that dogs can tell when their owners are coming home. Millions of people have had this experience. I've done experiments, and sure enough, at least some dogs really can know when people come at random times in unfamiliar vehicles. We film it all. We have all this objective evidence. But the very fact that I'm suggesting telepathy might be real is something that provokes this kind of hysterical response that it must be woo-woo pseudoscience, because my opponents believe it's impossible. So they don't think they need to look at the evidence. They think it's impossible, therefore this stuff must be fake or phony or fraudulent. What I'm doing fundamentally is challenging the materialist model of reality which science is based on, has been for more than 100 years, which is the doctrine that all matter is unconscious. The whole universe is made of unconscious matter, which then leaves the problem of how come we're conscious.
And it shouldn't reference a notion of God that is so denuded of doctrine as to more or less be synonymous with pure mystery or pure information or pure energy or pure anything.
So it's not so obvious what percentage of people see it this way. It may be that they have the intuitions, but they haven't been articulated well.
We can talk about anything we want. I'm happy to talk about consciousness. But please notice that when we migrate away from the God that is really shaping human events, or the God talk that is really shaping human events in our world at this moment.
And that's called the hard problem. Most scientists assume that consciousness exists only in human brains, and possibly in animal brains too. The liberal ones say maybe as far down as worms or something. But anyway, it's all only in brains. And the rest of the universe is unconscious, purposeless.
Let alone that he was the Son of God, let alone that his mother was a virgin, let alone that he was resurrected. None of these things, by the way, would prove he was the Son of God, if they did happen. Nor would they prove that his doctrines were not erroneous. A resurrected person who was the son of a virgin could still be talking nonsense. There's no logic that says he must be right. If I'm having an argument with you, sir, and you say, you lose, boy chick, I say, how come? Because my mother never went to bed with another man. Your logic is faulty. I think my case could remain just as strong as ever it was. In default of that, I must say, rather bizarre intervention.
You could do the same thing with the idea of ghosts, right? So people traditionally have believed in ghosts. It's an archetype, you might say, the ghost. Survival of death is certainly an archetype. And we know what most people most of the time mean when they say they believe in ghosts. And I say, I don't believe in ghosts. And you say, no, you do believe in ghosts. Ghosts are your relationship to the unseen. That's a ghost. So you have a new definition of ghost that you're putting in the place provided, which I have to say, well, of course I have a relationship to the unseen, so yeah, I guess I do believe in ghosts. You win that argument. But that simply isn't what most people mean by a ghost.
Obviously, there's absolutely no way of demonstrating this.
As human beings, we're uncomfortable with saying, I don't know. This is something I'm trying to teach people to become more comfortable with, is to say, I don't know.
I mean, I have big queries about naturalism as you described it there.
Okay.
In a much broader sense, yes. As you know, and many listeners will know, I started out being a parapsychologist and rejected ideas of clairvoyance and telepathy and ghosts and poltergeist because of lack of evidence. So that's one way to naturalism, to throw that lot out.
Going nowhere, evolution is just a matter of blind chance. There's no God out there. There's no spirit out there. There's no creativity out there. It's just chance.
We've done tests around that. It's down to random chance. Dogs don't know when their owners are coming home. We can demonstrate this in scientific laboratory conditions, double-blind testing, etc. Isn't that what they would say?
No, they don't say that.
Oh.
Well, first of all, they say it's anecdotal, but what I say to that is, well, if lots of people, I have more than 1,000 database. I've got more than 1,000 studies, case studies of dogs that do this, and 600 of cats. Well, I would say the plural of anecdote is data. If lots of people notice something, then to say this is rubbish because lots of people say they've noticed it isn't the right starting point for science that's meant to be empirical, and which means based on experience. So my response to this is to say, okay, well, let's test it. Well, it wasn't that they'd done the tests and shown it didn't happen. No one had ever done a test before because they assume it's rubbish.
There's a section, actually, Sue, in Jordan's book where he says this: Christianity elevated the individual soul, placing slave and master, commoner and nobleman alike, on the same metaphysical footing, rendering them equal before God and the law. It's nothing short of a miracle. He has a very high view of what Christianity has done for the world, whether or not it's objectively true. What do you take from it?
Well, that evidence that I was discussing earlier, that there's plenty of now, that the most dysfunctional societies are also the most believing societies. There are lots of hypotheses about why that is the case.
Because particularly in France, where atheism got going in a big way, much more than in England, the old regime that was overthrown in the French Revolution was very closely allied with the Church, the Roman Church.
Yes.
And they thought that to get rid of the king, you got to get rid of the Church too. And the best way to get rid of the power of the Church was to say God doesn't exist. So the whole thing's a ridiculous sham and pretense. So in the French Revolution in 1793, they abolished the Catholic Church in France. They closed the monasteries, they guillotined tens of thousands of priests, and they proclaimed the cult of reason as the state religion. Notre Dame Cathedral was turned into a temple of reason.
But I would like to challenge Jordan on the implication that he put before, that because a lot of these of our moral stance today comes from religion, and not all of it does, that it has to have that as a basis. I don't think it does. I feel very grateful to live in a country where now, at last, the majority are not religious. It's just tipped over in the latest polls.
Now, in Russia, you had a similar massive growth of atheism in the late 19th century. The Bolsheviks, whose revolution occurred almost 100 years ago, 1917, wanted to get rid of religion because they thought religion supported the Tsar and the state, and they wanted to destroy this religious underpinning. So science was an ally for them in this militant atheism.
And in fact, coming up on the train from Devon today, I got chatting with various people. The assumption that I find here, I don't know what it's like in Canada, is I always start with assuming someone's an atheist, and it nearly always turns out to be there. Oh yeah, all that religion stuff, you know. It's very, very common in this country. Now, we have not descended into being a terrible country. We have, yes, we have our problems.
We're still fairly early on in the experiment, I suppose, of ditching God.
Those who take this view, which we will call the secularist position in theology, are of course strongly influenced by contemporary philosophy, especially in that form which is called scientific empiricism or logical positivism.
And then, after the pioneering work of Russell, followed by that of Wittgenstein, who was a pupil of Russell, there developed in the 1920s in Austria the first fully fledged school devoted to the new philosophy, a school which was known as the Vienna Circle. To the philosophy they developed they gave the name logical positivism, and for a long time afterwards that label was attached to modern philosophy generally in the minds of very many laymen. The person who introduced logical positivism into England was A.J. Ayer, and his is the name that has been chiefly associated with it ever since in this country. He did so in a still very famous and widely read book called Language, Truth and Logic, which he published in January 1936 when he was only 25. It's very much a young man's book, explosively written, and it's still the best short guide to the central doctrines of logical positivism. The aggressiveness of that book was typical of the movement as a whole. They self-consciously organized themselves like a political party, with regular meetings and publications and international congresses, and they propagated their doctrines with missionary zeal. If we look at the question of what they were fighting against so passionately and why, I think that will provide us with the clearest starting point for our consideration of logical positivism. And then we'll be in a better position to go on and examine their own doctrines. Professor Eyre, what was it that the logical positivists were campaigning so passionately against?
Which maintains that the idea of God is not a fallacy, but is a meaningless idea.
So I was not hearing in that list of attributes a God who could care if anyone masturbated.
It depends on what else it's stopping you from doing.
But seriously. It's important to do something other than masturbate. I'm not hearing a God, a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them.
I think that what's happening there is that they are just getting rid of God.
For a God, because science can account for everything.
This is not this other thing I'm talking about, which could be called the religion of no religion.
The other side of the debate will argue that, in fact, science has brought us closer to God.
You see, if you could take this right into Christianity.
But do you deny that science cannot account for everything?
Yes, I do deny that science
So
can
what
account.
can't it account for?
Well, had you brought that up in the debate, I had a number of examples that I was going to give.
And so when you ask me about consciousness, my answer is, I don't know.
You know, it seems obvious at one level, and it's yet very difficult to grasp on the other.
But for other people, they're so uncomfortable with I don't know that they posit an explanation that they cannot justify, something that's untestable and unfalsifiable, and that is that there's a ghost in the machine.
Could you just talk to us about what
For
the barriers
some
are?
of us who were brought up, educated in a scientific worldview or in a worldview that emphasizes recycled information, as you said, or all of that, it's very difficult to intellectually get to being because we identify, as he said, perceptual experience with our intellect, with our mind, with our ego identity. So it always seems a struggle till one day you stop struggling and you're there.
Well, primarily they were against metaphysics, what they call metaphysics, and that was any suggestion that there might be a world going beyond the ordinary world of science and common sense, the world revealed to us by our senses. Already Kant, at the end of the 18th century, had said it was impossible to have any knowledge of anything that wasn't within the realm of possible sense experience.
That, in other words, the proposition that there exists God, and that God is the origin and creator and governor of everything that is happening, they maintain that those sentences are utterly devoid of meaning, as much so as if I were to say everything is up.
But these Viennese people went further. They said that any statement that wasn't either a formal statement, like a statement of logic or mathematics, or one that was empirically testable, was simply nonsensical. And so they cut away, therefore, all metaphysics in that sense.
And in Russia in the 1930s, they had about 5 million people belong to an organization called the League of the Militant Godless that went round
They sound terrifying.
Terrifying, bit like...
We are the League of the Militant Godless.
And I suppose that the two main scalpels that they
Yes.
used to tear away what they
Mhm.
regarded as all that diseased or dead intellectual tissue were logic and science, hence the name logical positivism.
Indeed. Because they will say no logical proposition can be made about all processes whatsoever, because all propositions are labels on boxes.
And this had some further implications. It was, for example, obviously a condemnation of any theology, any notion of there being a transcendent God. It wasn't quite so novel as all that. It was continuing an old, previous Viennese tradition that it must deal, in the last resort, simply with human sensations. Since all our knowledge of scientific facts comes through our senses, then Mach reasoned that in the last resort, science must simply be a description of sensation.
There's a tingling in the spine, a catch in the voice, a faint sensation as if a distant memory of falling from a great height. we know we are approaching the grandest of
Just a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them.
Just in hearing your response to all this then, Jordan, ultimately we can divorce the good principles that we may have had in some respects from religion ultimately and still leave perfectly happy secular
Well, it depends.
lives.
See, a lot of this depends on your definition of religion. Like I know...
It's very, very, very rare indeed to meet a physicist of any standing, from Einstein onwards, who is not at the most a Spinozist. In other words, someone who might say there could be a pantheism somewhere, there could be a force.
I know perfectly well from my own empirical studies that there's at least two disparate sets of phenomena that might be regarded as religious, right? There's the dogmatic element, which is really what Sue's referring to when she talks about the pathology of religious belief. And there's the spiritual element, and the dogmatic element tends to appeal to people who are essentially conservative in their temperamental nature, and I mean that scientifically speaking. And the meaningful element, the spiritual element, let's say, tends to appeal to people who are more liberal in their temperamental fundamentals.
But there is no way you can take a step from the laws of physics, the observable creation of the cosmos, that leads you to the belief that there is an intervening personal God who does answer prayers, who does watch over you, who does notice what you're up to, who does mind what you do, who you sleep with and in what position, what you eat and on what days of the week, what propitiations and sacrifices you will make, what commandments you will observe. There is no possible way, no one's even tried it, of getting from the laws of physics or biology to any such idea. So from the person who says, I'm a deist, I don't think all of this can be an accident, there must be some cosmic force, I say, I can't disprove it, though I think the cosmos functions without it, but you have all your work, sir, or ma'am, still ahead of you, before you can say that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person.
I believe our future depends powerfully on how well we understand this cosmos in which we float like a mote of dust in the morning sky.
All the laws appear to operate without that assumption.
And also, they would say, the notion that there is a God is meaningless because it doesn't help you to make any prediction.
And religion overall is a continual dialogue between the dogmatic element and the spiritual element, and if either of those exceeds its proper boundaries, then there's a degenerative consequence. Like if the spiritual types get the upper hand, then the structure disappears, and if the dogmatic types get the upper hand, then everything clamps down into too much stasis. So to make a direct claim, say, between the existence of dogmatic belief and the pathology of society, and then to assume that that encompasses the entire relationship between religion and the functioning of society, I think is based upon an unfortunate narrowing of the definition of what constitutes religious.
I don't believe there is a supernatural dimension, and I don't believe there have ever been any miracles, so I don't believe that prayers are answered, I don't believe any of this. None of this comes up so far in this argument. I'm not arguing with a religious person yet at all. I'm arguing with someone who claims to know more than I do about physics and biology. It's possible that he does. Many, many people do. But bear in mind that we cannot say that we know that there was not a prime mover. It's not within our compass. Pitifully ignorant as we are, only scrabbling on the lower slopes of the study of physics, as all of us are, even the best. We may not say that we know there was no prime mover. We may not say that. We can say that all the laws appear to operate without that assumption. It's very, very, very rare indeed to meet a physicist of any standing, from Einstein onwards, who is not at the most a Spinozist. In other words, someone who might say there could be a pantheism somewhere, there could be a force.
The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Our contemplations of the cosmos stir us.
That gratitude, which is one of the things that you quite rightly put into your book, it gives good place to it, and it's very important. That doesn't come from anything religious, unless you say because I was brought up a Christian it came from there, but I don't base it on that anymore.
What do you think it comes from?
I think it comes from a recognition that I've done a lot of meditation. I've meditated every day for 30 years, and I think this has something to do with it, but it's observing the inner consequences of different ways of confronting the world. And I'm much more in recent years in the habit of waking up in the morning, even if it's raining in January in England, and looking out and going, oh, and it's a feeling of gratitude, not gratitude towards God or towards anybody or anything, just free-floating gratitude. That seems to have a positive consequence. I set the day up better, and it's kind of self-perpetuating. It pops up again and again.
Do you think you can just have gratitude in general, or must gratitude always be given towards something and ultimately God?
That's a good question. That goes back to our discussion about acting things out. Like, gratitude is something you feel towards something.
That these myths have a certain use, even though we can't verify them. What they do is to give us a sense of the world making sense. So then, realize that people who adopt various theories of the world are actually mythologizing.
And you can say, well, I don't feel it towards anything in particular. And I would say, all right, well, the diffuse nothing that you feel it towards serves in your psychological hierarchy as your equivalent of God.
No, but it's gratitude. This morning, for example, I looked out and it was so green. We've had frosts and it's been white the last few days, and it was green this morning, and it was just gratitude to the universe, if you like. It's not really God because it's not a creator, it's not anything I can pray to. I know.
Why feel gratitude towards it then?
I don't know, but I find
That's fine.
I know that you tackle in this book that happiness is not an ultimate good, and I
No,
struggle
it's
this way.
just not an ultimate goal.
Oh, okay,
I didn't say it wasn't an ultimate
all right,
good.
all right, okay.
There's a big difference between
you're
those
right,
things.
You're right, you picked me up correctly on that.
Near the beginning, Rupert, you said that the basic model of mainstream science is a materialistic one, that matter is not conscious, and consciousness has at some point, in a way that we don't understand, emerged from matter. What do you think is the motivation for the defense of dogma? Why is rationalism and materialism so rigorously defended and alternative views so vehemently opposed?
Nevertheless, we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I have found through practice and growing older that acting gratitude, thinking gratitude, feeling gratitude makes me happier and seems to kind of rub off on other people.
So I don't think we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I think it's a low goal. Not because there's something wrong with being happy, because, thank God if you get to be happy now and then. But I don't think that that's what we seek. I think we seek a meaning that's deep enough to sustain us through tragedy. And that is way different.
Do you know, when I hit tragedy is too strong a word, I think... but when horrible things happen to me, or I feel, or I read some terrible thing going on in the world, yes, those are tragedies going on in the world, my response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it. Get on with it, girl.
That sounds like a very Zen Buddhist way of dealing.
I guess it is.
Meaning.
Well, it's a paradoxical way, though. Because
it is paradoxical.
The first part of that is nihilistic, and the second part isn't.
Because the observer and observed, as mind and body, are a single holistic activity of the total universe.
I've heard something like that before. When asked what is the Buddha, a Chinese master replied, "It's windy again this morning." Another Buddhist master, on his deathbed, wrote the poem, "From the bathtub to the bathtub, I have uttered stuff and nonsense. The bathtub in which the baby is washed at birth, and the bathtub in which the corpse is washed before burial. All the time between," he said, "I was going yakety-yak." Now, what about those poems? Do they mean what they say? Well, not quite. There's something different here, because they are based on a life devoted to the discipline of a very particular kind of meditation, culminating in a completely shattering experience, which is very difficult to talk about.
Then these instruments of perception are no good. Even what is light and darkness is a debate between you and another creature which sees darkness as light.
Well, it's kind of political. Originally it was political. In the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, materialism was quite a small minority view. Within biology, a lot of people were vitalists. They thought there was a life force or some life principle. It wasn't just matter. Organisms weren't just machines. But the materialists wanted to believe that because they wanted a universe that's just matter, because such a universe would have no God in it.
Why did they want that?
Listen, if you sit with an owl and start an argument as to which is light and which is darkness, it's an endless argument, but who do you think is right? Hello? If you're saying both, you're either in the diplomatic corps or you have a successful marriage.
So how do you reconcile those two things?
Which,
Why get on with it, girl?
Because, well, here's another thing. I've often done this with my students. Let's suppose you become nihilistic. Nothing matters. There's no point in doing it. I mean, I think we live in a pointless universe. What are you going to do? And I say to them, like William James in his wonderful thing about getting up in the morning, but that's a slightly different point that he makes there. But I say to them, okay, tomorrow morning, when you wake up, think it's all pointless. There's no point in doing anything. Now, what are you going to do? Well, actually, you're going to need to go to the loo. You're going to get out of bed and you're going to go to the bathroom. And when you're there, you'll think, actually, I'm hungry. I think I want to go down to the kitchen. I probably should put my slippers on. Why don't I get dressed? You go and have something to eat. And then you think, I'm bored. And you go to university and get into your lectures.
Which is the truth? What I see is the truth, or what the owl sees is the truth? That's not the point. It is just that nature has opened up our sense perception as it is necessary for our survival. Accordingly, it has opened up sense perceptions for different creatures as it is necessary for their survival. But if survival is all you're seeking, this is good enough.
And, we are not creatures who will just not do anything. To me, to go through that process, which I've done in the past a lot, and it's just natural now, is a very positive way of living.
The five senses. But once you have come as a human being, somehow survival is not good enough. If your stomach is empty, there's only one issue about food. But once the stomach becomes full, you have 100 issues going on. So the nature of the human being is such, no matter what you do, you want to be something more than what you are right now.
To accept the meaningless and ultimate emptiness of everything, and accept that this creature here, this thing, this evolved creature just will get on with life.
But you're not accepting the meaninglessness of it, even by going through those actions that you described.
You don't think so?
Not at all, because you're acting as if those things are meaningful.
Yes, I am. I'm
right.
acting as though those things are
meaningful. Are you pretending that they're meaningful?
Pardon?
Are you pretending that they're meaningful?
No, I'm not pretending. My way of putting it would be that those meanings are constructed by myself and others.
They're personal
and they're
because
the kind of creatures we are, because of the meme
But they're not constructed.
I'd like to
Hunger isn't constructed, neither is your desire to use the loo. None of that's constructed.
No.
And if that something more happens, something more, it's an endless pursuit. So somewhere a human being is seeking a limitless expansion.
But generally speaking, it is the encounter with eternity, with the eternal, not necessarily in the sense of that which goes on and on through time, but
trying to do it with physical means.
The eternal is the timeless. That which transcends time is beyond measurement in terms of hours and days.
The very nature of physicality is a defined boundary. If there is no defined boundary, there is no possibility of physical happening in the universe. But now, a human being is longing for the boundless, that too in installments, and through physical means. Through the boundary, you're trying to become boundless.
But the fact that there is a loo is part of culture.
Yeah, well, thank God for that.
Yeah.
But see…
Oh, you thank God, would you, for that? Sorry, that's a poor joke.
Well, you see…
The desire is fantastic. The method is hopeless.
See, so imagine this. You have the proximal meanings that you described that are sort of a priori, right?
Yep.
They're handed to you. You might consider them as needs or drives, although they're not. They're personalities. That's not the right way of conceptualizing them. But then there's the intermingling of all those needs and drives, let's say, and that constitutes a new layer of structure.
Because the moment you identify yourself with something, your intellect's work is just to protect that identity. If whatever the identities of nation or family or gender or race, religion, whatever, the moment you identify yourself with something, your intellect will only function around that to protect that.
Because it isn't just that you have to eat and that you have to use the washroom and that you have to have something to drink and that you have to be warm enough or cool enough to survive. It's that you have to do all those things at the same time in a situation where you're going to have to propagate that across time, and you're going to have to do it with a bunch of other people. And it's always been like that.
So it is a certain type of prejudice the moment you're identified.
And when a person who is in that state of consciousness or has been through it looks at the ordinary everyday world, it's true he sees the ordinary everyday world as we see it, but with a very, very extraordinary difference.
And so what that means is that out of those proximal meanings, higher meanings arise. And you might say, well, those meanings are arbitrary, and I would think those are religious meanings.
I wouldn't say they are arbitrary, but I would say they were constructed. It's very interesting. Reading your book…
What do you mean by constructed?
Well, they are a consequence of mimetic evolution, of the language that people are brought up in, the culture they live in, the arguments they have. I mean,
what about the biology that they're given?
Well, we start with the biology, and the memes build on top of that.
The memes are biology too.
Well, by definition, they are. Well,
see, this is the thing.
I would follow Dawkins in saying, well, talk about genes as biology, talk about memes as culture. That's all I meant by dividing that. But let me say this.
Yeah, but I don't accept that division.
But I want to get back to what we're saying about meaning. Reading your book made me think a lot about what you mean by meaning, and your claim that we should have a meaningful life or strive for a meaningful life, that meaningfulness is important. And I kept asking myself, do I live that way? What meanings does my life have? And, if I think of something like, well, most of my striving goes into writing my books. And is that meaningful? And again, I have the same response when I ask myself that question. It's just what this body does.
Then you should listen to the body and stop listening to the thing that's criticizing it.
And what would the body say?
It would say, write your book and try to be as clear as you possibly can
that's
about
what I
it.
do. And that's
right,
exactly what I do.
What I said at the beginning is that the atheist types act out a religious structure and criticize it.
No, there's no religious structure. We come to this big question now.
And if we would have to put that difference into some sort of Western Christian-influenced language, he would perhaps say, don't you realize that sitting around here in this room...
Localness. And I know both of you have spoken about that.
The thing is, this is not something that people will not get. They will get this. This is not some great teaching I'm telling you.
With our ordinary everyday faces and clothes and personalities.
If you get it right now in your life will transform in ways that you can't imagine possible.
We are sitting smack in the middle of the beatific vision.
Otherwise, someday you will get it from the maggots.
And that this, sitting here in this room, is infinity and eternity precisely.
You will understand you don't belong to anything. So, the entire culture of what you're calling as Bharat is about Vairagya. The word Vairagya means, Rag means color, Vairag means beyond color. But if you say colorless in English language, it is a very negative connotation of being colorless. Let's put it as transparent. Because it's transparent, it can take on the color of anything right now.
It is it. And this is the beatific vision.
Right now, if my background is red, I'm red. If it's yellow, I'm yellow.
This is God. And it…
So the only thing I did with my life is, I never identified myself with anything. And life just exploded within me in ways that thought seems so puny that I do not indulge in thought most of the time.
Because I did want to get to this, because you have a fascinating part in your book, Jordan, where you do say this. You're simply not addressing atheists. You say you're simply not an atheist in your actions, and it is your actions.
Or if you are, look out.
And it is your actions that most accurately reflect your religious beliefs. What do you mean by that? Why are you saying that no one is really an atheist deep down?
I didn't say no one was.
Okay.
I said that most of the people who claim to be atheists aren't. So this is why I like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, because Raskolnikov tried to act like an atheist, right? He took the ideas that were floating around, Dostoevsky took the ideas that were floating around in the late 1800s, which are still the ideas that we're discussing today. One most fundamental idea, I suppose, being after Nietzsche's announcement of the death of God, that if there is no God, then anything is permitted. That was Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov's the criminal in Crime and Punishment, the murderer. He gets away with his murder, technically, but not psychologically. And he decides that if there's no God, anything is permitted.
But
and
this
he can't
doesn't
see
have
a reason.
to be true. That's a person in a character in a novel. I don't think that's so.
Well, let's hear the end of that story. And what do you take away from what Dostoevsky has to say about?
Well, Dostoevsky's takeaway was that there was a moral law that Raskolnikov was breaking, even though he rationalized his way through it. Like, he committed the perfect murder, right? He murdered a woman who people would have voted to murder, and then he got away with it. And he did it for good reasons, at least reasons that he could rationalize as good. And then he got away with it, but it destroyed his soul.
As he said, he never identified with anything. Once you identify with a thought or with a perception or with what you think is a knowing or a sensation or an emotion, then you're in time. Thought is in time, but being is not in time.
I'm completely spiritually uneducated. I don't know from where I have quoted. I have not quoted generally, except a modern scientist is trying to deduce, mathematically deduce the reality. Everything has to fit in to his math, and he will deduct everything and say the entire universe is one, but it's not in his experience. A religious person will say, God is everywhere, so everything is one, but it's not yet in his experience, he believes. One is making deductions, another is believing. A yogi is a hard nut who doesn't believe anything, who doesn't want to deduce anything. Unless it becomes real within him, it's not real for him. So, because of this approach, I never found the need to read anything spiritual. If I read something, it may be a news magazine, and the only and only thing I know is, I know this piece of life from its origin to its ultimate, and that's all.